She walked through the double glass doors of Ma's diner at 5:15 in the morning, the way she had done every single day for the last 6 years. The streetlights outside were still humming against the pre-dawn mist, casting a cool, blue haze over the damp pavement of Main Street. Inside, the diner smelled of stale filter coffee, pine cleanser, and warm butter sizzling on the iron grill. My name is Sarah Miller. I am 34 years old. With quiet brown eyes and dark hair I usually pin back into a tight, practical knot before my shift begins. I wore my daily uniform, a navy blue polo shirt with Ma's Diner embroidered in white lettering over the left pocket, a crisp black apron tied securely around my waist, and non-slip shoes that had walked thousands of miles across this worn, beige linoleum floor. I wasn't someone who made a splash. I was a single mother working 48 hours a week to keep a modest roof over my 10-year-old daughter Maya's head. My life was defined by simple, relentless arithmetic: rent payments, grocery budgets, tip jars, school supplies, and late-night utility bills. But if there was one thing 6 years of waiting tables had taught me, it was how to read people. You see thousands of faces pass through a diner booth over the years, and eventually, you learn that almost every single person carries a quiet weight behind their eyes, a story they rarely tell out loud. At precisely 6:15 a.m., the small brass bell mounted above the front entrance door chimed softly. I didn't even have to look up from the steaming coffee urn to know who it was. Arthur Pendelton walked in, his shoulders slightly hunched against the crisp morning draft. Arthur was 78 years old, a retired structural engineer whose wife, Clara, had passed away 3 years prior. He was a man of strict, unwavering habit. Every morning, without fail, he sat at the exact same corner booth, the one right beside the large front window overlooking the sleepy, tree-lined intersection. He wore his usual outfit: a faded blue and green plaid flannel shirt, a heather gray cotton undershirt, and a slate gray canvas jacket that hung a little too loosely on his aging frame. His silver hair was neatly combed to the side, though his eyes carried that soft, heavy, clouded look of a man who spent far more time living in his memories than in the present moment. "Morning, Arthur," I said, stepping up to his booth with a fresh pot of dark roast coffee and a thick ceramic mug. "Morning, Sarah," Arthur replied, his voice a low, gentle rasp. He offered a polite, faint smile, the kind of quiet courtesy he gave to everyone, even when his own heart was clearly heavy. I poured his coffee right to the rim, leaving just enough room for a generous splash of cream. He ordered his usual breakfast without looking at the menu: 2 sunny-side-up eggs, 2 golden buttermilk pancakes, and a side of crispy hash browns. I scribbled the order down on my green guest check pad, gave him a warm nod, and headed back toward the kitchen pass-through window. For the next 20 minutes, the diner slowly began to fill with the usual early morning rush. Commuters in business suits grabbing quick travel mugs, municipal road workers in high-visibility vests eating hearty platters, and elderly regulars chatting loudly across the counter. But as I carried a heavy tray of fresh breakfast plates out from the kitchen, my eyes drifted toward Arthur's corner booth, and my chest immediately tightened. Arthur was staring down at his plate in complete silence. He had taken only 2 tiny bites of his egg, but his fork was now resting motionless against the edge of the white ceramic dish. His hands were resting flat on the laminate tabletop, trembling so subtly that only someone paying close attention would notice. He was staring out the window into the misty street, his jaw clenched tight, swallowing hard as if trying to hold back a rising wave of unbearable, overwhelming emotion. I had served Arthur almost every single morning for 3 full years. I knew his routine better than my own. Normally, he read the local county newspaper or quietly solved the daily crossword puzzle while he ate. Today, his newspaper sat folded and completely untouched beside his untouched coffee mug. As I walked past his table to clear empty dishes from an adjacent booth, I noticed something else, something subtle and chilling that made the small hairs on the back of my neck stand up straight. Standing near the cash register, leaning against the wooden counter with a cold, impatient posture, was a man in his late 90s named Richard Vance. Richard was a well-known local commercial property developer, a man infamous around town for buying up small, family-owned lots at distressed prices and pushing vulnerable elderly residents into quick, regretful sales. Richard wasn't looking at a menu, nor was he ordering food. He was staring directly at Arthur, checking his expensive gold wristwatch every 30 seconds, his expression dark, sharp, and calculating. I caught Richard's eye for a brief, tense second, and he immediately looked away, pretending to browse the display of mints and gum near the register. But the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Something deeply wrong was happening right in front of me, in the very diner where people were supposed to feel safe and welcomed. I stepped back behind the stainless steel kitchen counter, my heart beating fast against my ribs. My mind began racing, connecting small, scattered fragments of conversation I had overheard in the diner over the past several weeks. Whispers about property tax reassessments, aggressive buyout offers, delinquent land notices, and shady corporate developers targeting solitary landowners living on the edge of town. Arthur lived alone on a scenic 5-acre plot of land that his family had owned for over 60 years, a prime piece of real estate that Richard Vance had been trying to acquire for a massive commercial strip mall development. I knew that if I spoke out loud, if I confronted Richard directly in the middle of a crowded diner, it would create an uncomfortable public scene. Arthur was a proud, dignified man of the old school. A public spectacle might cause him to shut down, retreat out of embarrassment, or sign something just to make the pressure disappear. An elderly man's dignity is a delicate, precious thing, and Arthur was a man who would rather suffer in silence than ever ask a stranger for help. I reached into my apron pocket, pulled out my ballpoint pen, and grabbed a clean guest check slip from my pad. Leaning against the stainless steel prep table, I began to write. My handwriting was deliberate, bold, and clear. I wrote 3 concise lines on the back of the paper, ensuring every word was unmistakable. When I finished, I folded the paper neatly in half, pressing the crease down flat and crisp, so it looked like an ordinary itemized meal receipt. I picked up the warm refill plate containing Arthur's breakfast, walked out into the dining room, and approached his booth with steady, calm steps. As I reached his table, I leaned down slightly, keeping my posture calm and casual. I placed my left hand near his coffee mug to anchor myself, and with my right hand, I carefully slid the folded paper beneath the right edge of his breakfast plate, leaving just a small corner of the white paper visible against the formica surface. Arthur looked up, startled out of his dark thoughts. His pale blue eyes met mine, filled with deep confusion, exhaustion, and a silent plea for help. I didn't say a single word out loud. I didn't announce the paper. I simply gave him a soft, firm, reassuring nod, a quiet signal between 2 human beings that said, "I see what is happening, and you do not have to face this alone." I straightened my back, tucked my tray under my arm, and walked calmly back toward the kitchen counter, leaving Arthur alone in the booth with his plate and the hidden note. Arthur sat frozen for a long, heavy moment. Slowly, his eyes drifted down to the edge of the plate where the crisp white paper peeked out from underneath. With weathered, trembling fingers, he reached out and gently slid the note free. He unfolded it beneath the shadow of his palm, shielding the text so no one else in the room could see what was written. The note read, "Richard Vance is standing at the register waiting for you to leave so he can pressure you. Do not sign any document today. My older brother David is a legal aid attorney specializing in elderly property rights. His direct cell number is on the back of this slip. Call him right now from your booth. I have your back, Arthur. You are not alone." Arthur's hand stopped trembling. A long, shuddering breath escaped his chest, rattling softly in his throat. He stared at those handwritten words as if they were a lifeline thrown to him in the middle of a dark, turbulent sea. Slowly, he lifted his head, searching across the busy diner until his eyes locked onto mine. I was wiping down the glass pastry display, but I met his gaze and gave him another subtle, confident nod. For the first time in months, the heavy, defeated posture in Arthur's shoulders visibly relaxed. The shadow of terror that had been consuming his face melted away into something profound, a quiet, overwhelming sense of relief and restored strength. He didn't panic. He didn't crumble. Instead, Arthur slowly reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out his mobile phone, and dialed the number written on the back of the note. For 5 minutes, he spoke in low, measured tones to my brother David, explaining the harassment, the misleading contract threats, and the unannounced visits Richard Vance had been making to his home late at night. When Richard Vance finally grew impatient and walked over to Arthur's booth holding a thick leather folder filled with legal buyout forms, the atmosphere in the room completely transformed. Richard placed the folder on the table, leaning in close with a practiced, predatory smile, whispering that time was running out and that the county would seize Arthur's land if he didn't sign the transfer papers immediately. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't look down at the papers. He calmly folded his hands on top of the table, looked Richard Vance straight in the eye, and spoke with a voice clear enough for half the diner to hear. "Mr. Vance," Arthur said, his tone ringing with absolute authority, "I am fully aware of what you are trying to do. I have just spoken with my legal counsel. If you step foot on my property or approach me in public again without my lawyer present, formal harassment charges will be filed against you and your development firm by 11 o'clock this morning. Please pick up your papers and leave my table." Richard's face flushed a deep, angry red. He opened his mouth to argue, but when he looked around the diner, he realized that several patrons and 2 local police officers who had just walked in for coffee were watching him intently. Realizing his deceitful trap had completely collapsed, Richard snatched his leather folder off the table, turned on his heel, and marched out of the diner, the brass bell ringing furiously behind him. The entire energy of the diner seemed to lighten. Arthur sat quietly for a moment, letting the adrenaline settle. Then, he picked up his fork and began eating his breakfast with an appetite he hadn't possessed in years. 2 weeks later, through my brother David's pro bono legal assistance, it was discovered that Richard Vance had been using fraudulent tax notices and forged county letters to intimidate elderly residents throughout the township into selling their ancestral lands far below market value. The county prosecutor launched a formal investigation, shutting down Vance's predatory operations for good and securing protective land trusts for Arthur and 3 other elderly families in our community. A month after that fateful morning, Arthur walked into Ma's diner at 6:15 a.m., just as he always did. But this time, he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a young woman, his granddaughter, whom he hadn't seen in over 2 years due to family misunderstandings that had finally been healed once his home was secured. When I brought his coffee to the corner booth, Arthur smiled up at me, a real, radiant, joyful smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He reached into his pocket and handed me a small, hand-drawn card made by his granddaughter. Inside, written in simple, elegant lettering, were words I will cherish for the rest of my life. "Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible." Sometimes, changing a person's entire world doesn't require a grand gesture, massive wealth, or loud speeches. Sometimes, all it takes is paying attention when the rest of the world is too busy to notice. It takes a single moment of courage, a folded piece of paper, and the simple human decision to stand up for someone who needs to know they aren't fighting their battles alone. Before this story comes to an end, we would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced a moment where a complete stranger showed up for you right when you needed it most? Leave a meaningful comment below, because your story might give someone else the hope they need today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs encouragement today, and subscribe to my channel for more emotional journeys that remind us what truly matters in life. Remember, never underestimate a small act of kindness, because a quiet note passed across a table can become the very miracle that saves a person's life.